When my husband and I moved into our new neighborhood a few weeks ago, we were beyond excited. The house was perfect for us, spacious, with a beautiful yard where our 2 dogs could run around freely. It was everything we had been looking for. We had lived in apartments for years, so finally having our own space, without having to share walls with noisy neighbors, felt like a dream come true. We spent our first few days unpacking, decorating, and making the house feel like home. From the very beginning, it was obvious that we were different from most of the other families in the neighborhood. For one, we were the only childless couple on the block. Every other household had kids, ranging from toddlers to preteens, and they all seemed to know each other very well. The street was always lively, filled with the sounds of kids playing, laughing, and sometimes screaming. Parents gathered outside, chatting with each other while their children rode bikes, played tag, or splashed around in backyard pools. It was the kind of neighborhood that, I suppose, would be a dream for any young family. But my husband and I? We never wanted children. We had made that decision early in our relationship, and we were completely content with our lives just as they were. We were friendly, of course, we made an effort to introduce ourselves to the neighbors, exchanged pleasantries, and even made small talk when we ran into them while walking our dogs. But we had no interest in joining their barbecue parties or pool gatherings. The noise, the chaos, the constant presence of children running around, it simply was not for us. It did not take long for some of the parents to notice that we were a little more reserved than they would have liked. A few made passive-aggressive comments about how we should come out of our shell or be part of the community. One woman even joked, "You two need to get used to kids, they're everywhere here." We would just smile politely and change the subject. It was not that we were unfriendly, we just preferred our own space and quiet. Then, yesterday, something happened that took me completely by surprise. One of our neighbors, a woman named Linda, came over in the afternoon while I was outside in our yard. I had met her a couple of times before and had exchanged a few words with her in passing. She seemed nice enough, though a little pushy. That day, she walked up to me with a bright smile and said, "Hey. I was wondering if you could do me a huge favor." Curious, I asked what she needed. That was when she dropped it on me. She wanted me to babysit her 2 children, ages 5 and 7, for the entire day on Saturday. I was caught completely off guard. Babysitting? For an entire day? I had never even held a baby before, let alone watched 2 young children by myself. I did not know the first thing about childcare, and, more importantly, I did not want to babysit. It was not something I felt comfortable doing, and I was not about to put myself in a situation that made me uneasy. I politely declined, explaining to her as kindly as I could that I just did not feel comfortable watching children, especially ones so young. I even mentioned that I had work that weekend. I do freelance work on the side, and my weekends are the most productive time for me. I did not want to reschedule my work just to take care of someone else's kids. Linda's smile faltered for a second, but she quickly recovered and said, "Oh, okay, no problem." She turned around and left without another word. I assumed that was the end of it. It was not. A couple of hours later, her husband showed up at my doorstep. He knocked hard, too hard, honestly, and when I opened the door, he had this serious, almost angry look on his face. Before I could even greet him, he launched into a speech. "My wife told me you refused to babysit," he said, his tone accusing. "I just want to understand why." I blinked, completely taken aback. Why was this man standing at my door, demanding an explanation for something that should not have even been an issue? I told him the same thing I told his wife, that I was not comfortable watching kids, and that I had work to do. That should have been enough. But instead of accepting my answer, he scoffed. "Not comfortable? That's not a real reason," he said. "You're a woman. How can you not be comfortable around kids?" That set something off in me. The condescension, the entitlement, the blatant assumption that just because I am a woman, I should naturally be okay with taking care of children, it made my blood boil. I told him, rather firmly, that he did not get to decide what I was or was not comfortable with. That I had no obligation to watch his children just because I was childless. That there were plenty of other parents in the neighborhood who could help, or that they could hire a babysitter like normal people. But then he said something that made me see red. "Why would we pay someone when you're childless and available for free?" I lost it. I completely lost it. I told him, loudly and clearly, that I was not a free babysitter just because I did not have kids of my own. That I did not appreciate being treated like some kind of unpaid nanny just because they assumed I had nothing better to do. And then, in a moment of pure, unfiltered rage, I told him to fuck off and never come to me with such a ridiculous request again. He looked stunned for a moment, then stormed off. I slammed the door, still fuming. And then? The neighborhood group chat exploded. Apparently, Linda and her husband wasted no time in running to their friends and painting me as the villain. The messages started pouring in. I can't believe you wouldn't help out a neighbor in need. It takes a village. You should be more supportive. You don't even have kids, what's the big deal? One even said, if you hate kids so much, why did you move into a family-friendly neighborhood? I was floored. I never said I hated kids. I never said I had a problem with parents. I simply said no to babysitting. But somehow, I was now the neighborhood pariah because I refused to be guilt-tripped into something I did not want to do. When my husband got home and I told him what happened, he was furious. He wanted to go outside and give them a piece of his mind, but I stopped him. I was exhausted. I did not want to escalate things further. But now, after seeing all the messages and hearing all the criticism, I am starting to wonder. Was I wrong? Should I have just said yes and helped them out? I know parenting is hard. I know finding babysitters is tough. But does that mean I am obligated to step in just because I am childless? I was so sure I was in the right, but now, with the entire neighborhood seemingly against me, I am starting to doubt myself. Am I the asshole? Update 1. I thought that after the explosion in the neighborhood group chat, things would start to die down. People get angry, they rant, they vent their frustrations, and then they move on. That's how these things usually go, right? I figured I would just keep my head down, go about my life, and eventually, the neighborhood drama would shift to someone else. I was wrong. Very wrong. If anything, things got worse. Much worse. The first sign that the situation had escalated beyond normal neighborhood gossip was when I noticed that people started actively avoiding me. Not just the passive cold shoulder, but full-on, intentional avoidance. When I walked my dogs, other neighbors who used to greet me with a polite nod or a quick hello would turn and walk in the opposite direction. When I went out to get the mail, I could feel eyes on me from behind closed curtains, like I was some kind of intruder in my own neighborhood. It was as if my refusal to babysit had turned me into a pariah overnight. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that people would get over it eventually. But then, things started getting even more bizarre. One morning, my husband and I woke up to find that someone had left a stack of parenting books on our front porch. Not just one or two, but an entire box filled with titles like Learning to Love Children, The Joy of Motherhood, and It Takes a Village, Why Childless Women Should Step Up. It was ridiculous. I laughed at first, thinking maybe it was some kind of twisted joke, but my husband was furious. He wanted to check the doorbell camera footage, but for some reason, it had been disabled. That's when the paranoia set in. Someone had been on our porch in the middle of the night, leaving passive-aggressive gifts, and they had managed to disable our camera. That wasn't normal neighborly behavior. That was unsettling. And it didn't stop there. The next time I went to the grocery store, I saw two of my neighbors, women I had spoken to a handful of times, standing by the entrance. The moment they saw me, they started whispering to each other, loud enough that I could tell they wanted me to hear. "That's her," one of them muttered. "The one who refused to help Linda." "The selfish one," the other responded. I bit my tongue and kept walking. I wasn't about to engage with them. I just wanted to get my groceries and go home. But as I moved through the aisles, I kept noticing the same thing, people staring, people whispering. I had become the subject of a neighborhood-wide smear campaign, and the worst part was, I had no idea how to stop it. Then, things took an even darker turn. One evening, while I was outside in the yard with my dogs, I heard laughter. Not the light-hearted kind, but the cruel, mocking kind. I turned around and saw a group of kids, somewhere between 10 and 12 years old, standing on the sidewalk, pointing at me. "You hate kids, don't you?" one of them called out. "You're a witch," another added. I stared at them in shock. I had never spoken to these kids in my life. Where were they getting this from? Before I could say anything, they ran off, still laughing, as if they had just pulled the greatest prank in the world. I told my husband about it that night, and he was livid. He wanted to confront the parents, but I begged him not to. it would only make things worse. If the parents were already turning against us, what good would it do to go knocking on their doors, accusing their kids of harassment? But then, the final straw came. One day, I went to leave for a meeting, and the second I stepped outside, I froze. There was something smeared all over our driveway. At first, I thought it was just dirt, but as I stepped closer, the smell hit me. It was disgusting. Someone had dumped dirty diapers, actual dirty diapers, all over our property. I stood there, frozen, bile rising in my throat. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the message behind it. This wasn't just some petty gossip or passive-aggressive social exclusion. This was a direct, deliberate statement. I went back inside, shaking, and told my husband. He stormed outside, cursing, and immediately started cleaning it up. I wanted to call the police, but he convinced me not to. They won't do anything, he said. It's just garbage. They'll call it a prank. And maybe he was right. Maybe this was just another cruel joke. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. Something bigger. I started to wonder, was this really just about the babysitting incident? Or had we unknowingly stepped into something much deeper? That night, unable to sleep, I decided to dig a little deeper. I went back through the neighborhood group chat, looking at old messages, trying to see if there was some kind of pattern. And that's when I noticed something strange. The same names kept coming up, over and over, in different conflicts. Linda. Her husband. A few other couples. They had a habit of targeting certain people. I scrolled back further. A year ago, there was another family, new to the neighborhood, who had suddenly moved out. The reason? They were rude and didn't fit in. Before that, another family. Not the right kind of people, someone had commented. And before that? A single woman. She was selfish. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just about me. This was what they did. They found someone, singled them out, made their lives miserable until they left. And I had walked right into it. The dirty diapers. The books. The whispering. The kids harassing me. It was all part of their game. My blood ran cold as I realized something even more terrifying. I was their new target. And they weren't going to stop. Update 2. After the diaper incident, I knew we couldn't just sit back and wait for things to escalate even further. The pattern was clear, this neighborhood had a history of singling people out, wearing them down, and driving them away. I refused to be the next person forced out of my own home. If they thought they could bully me into submission, they were in for a rude awakening. My husband and I immediately decided that we needed to take action. The first step? More security cameras. We had one camera by the front door, but after discovering that it had been disabled the night of the parenting book stunt, we realized we needed more coverage. So we invested in a full security system, multiple cameras covering every angle of our property, including the driveway, backyard, and side entrances. These were not just the basic doorbell cameras either. We went all out, getting high-quality motion-detecting cameras with night vision and cloud storage. My husband installed them himself over the weekend, ensuring that no one could tamper with them this time. Once everything was set up, we felt a small sense of control returning. If anyone tried anything again, we would have proof. And sure enough, it didn't take long before we caught something. It happened just a few nights after the cameras were installed. We had started to relax a little, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the neighbors had finally gotten bored and moved on. But when we checked the footage the next morning, our blood ran cold. There, in the grainy black and white night vision footage, was a figure creeping onto our property. At first, it was hard to make out who it was. The person was dressed in dark clothing, moving cautiously toward our driveway. But as they got closer, the camera picked up their face. It was him. Linda's husband. The same man who had confronted me at my doorstep, the same man who had scoffed at my refusal to babysit, the same man who had insisted I was available for free just because I was childless. And here he was, sneaking onto my property in the dead of night. We watched as he bent down near our driveway, though we couldn't see exactly what he was doing. But the next morning, we found the evidence, small nails scattered across the pavement. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to potentially puncture our tires if we hadn't been careful. That was it. That was the final straw. We called the police. I had hesitated before, thinking that getting the police involved might escalate the situation, but at this point, it was clear these people were not going to stop unless there were real consequences. My husband and I filed a formal complaint, and when we showed the officers the footage, they took it very seriously. It wasn't just a case of neighborhood bullying anymore, this was intentional property damage and a blatant attempt to cause harm. The police went to Linda and her husband's house the very next day. We didn't hear what was said, but we saw them standing on their porch, their faces pale as the officers spoke to them. A short while later, we received an update: her husband had been issued a fine for trespassing and attempted vandalism. He wasn't arrested, but it was still an official mark against him. If he did anything else, he would be facing more serious charges. And just like that, everything changed. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been flipped upside down. The whispering stopped. The passive-aggressive stares disappeared. The neighborhood group chat, which had been so hostile before, suddenly went silent. No one spoke to us, but more importantly, no one bothered us anymore. Even the kids who had taunted me a week earlier started avoiding our house, as if their parents had told them to steer clear. At first, I thought it was just temporary. That they were regrouping, figuring out their next move. But as the days passed, it became clear that the police intervention had actually worked. Linda and her husband, once the ringleaders of the social harassment campaign against us, were now the ones facing social exile. The same people who had joined in mocking us were now keeping their distance from them. It was as if they had been stripped of their power the moment law enforcement got involved. It was almost eerie how quickly the dynamic shifted. One of the most telling moments happened when I went out to walk my dogs and ran into one of the other moms in the neighborhood, the same woman who had openly whispered about me at the grocery store. This time, instead of looking at me with disdain, she looked away awkwardly, as if she didn't know how to act now that the tide had turned. I didn't say anything. I just walked past her, holding my head high. Over the next few weeks, the change became even more noticeable. The neighborhood events we had once been pushed away from continued, but without Linda and her husband at the center of them. I even overheard one conversation between two dads at the park, talking about how they had taken it too far and should have left it alone. Apparently, some of the neighbors had not been entirely on board with the harassment campaign, but they had gone along with it because of social pressure. Now that the pressure had reversed, they were acting like they had never been involved. Typical. Linda and her husband, meanwhile, had gone almost completely silent. They stopped engaging in the group chat. They stopped hosting get-togethers. I barely saw them outside anymore. It was as if they were the ones being frozen out now. And I couldn't lie, it was satisfying. For the first time since moving in, I felt like we could breathe again. We no longer had to worry about waking up to some new prank or form of harassment. The peace and quiet we had originally moved here for was finally returning. My husband and I still kept our distance from the neighbors. We weren't about to suddenly start attending the block parties or neighborhood cookouts, but we no longer felt like outsiders in our own home. It took weeks, but things gradually settled down. I started walking my dogs, without worrying about being ambushed by whispering parents or mocking kids. My husband and I sat outside in the evenings without feeling like we were being watched. The best part? The security cameras remained up. Even though the neighborhood seemed calmer now, I wasn't about to take any chances. We had learned the hard way that just because things seem peaceful, doesn't mean they actually are. For now, everything seemed to be returning to normal. But if there was one thing I had learned, it was this. I would never underestimate these people again. In the weeks that followed the fallout, I found myself replaying everything in my mind, over and over again. I analyzed every decision, every reaction, every word exchanged between myself and the neighbors. I thought about that moment when I had first refused to babysit, the sheer entitlement in Linda's husband's voice when he had tried to guilt me into doing it, and the way the neighborhood had turned on me like a pack of wolves the moment I stood my ground. And yet, despite everything, the whispering, the harassment, the dirty diapers on my property, the attempts to vandalize my driveway, there was a small part of me that wondered, was I really the problem? It was an uncomfortable thought. The logical part of me knew that I had every right to say no. I wasn't responsible for their children. I wasn't obligated to put aside my work and my comfort just to accommodate people who had never once considered what I wanted. And more importantly, their reaction, the cruel, targeted harassment, was wildly disproportionate to the situation. But another part of me wondered if, in some twisted way, I had broken some unspoken rule of suburban life. Maybe in neighborhoods like this, there was an expectation of communal involvement, of shared responsibility. Maybe my refusal to participate had been seen as a betrayal of some deep-rooted, almost tribal social contract. If I had said yes, if I had babysat Linda's kids for that one day, would things have played out differently? Would I have been welcomed into the neighborhood rather than ostracized? Would I have been seen as a team player, someone they could count on, rather than an outsider who refused to contribute? The thought made my stomach churn. Because deep down, I knew the answer. No. No, it wouldn't have changed a damn thing. If I had agreed to babysit, it wouldn't have been a one-time favor. That much was obvious. The moment I had given in, the moment I had proven that I could be leaned on, they would have seen me as an easy, free solution to their childcare problems. It would have started with that one Saturday. Then another parent would have asked. Then another. Before I knew it, I would have become the neighborhood babysitter, expected to be on call whenever someone needed to run an errand or have a date night. And if I had ever dared to say no after that? The reaction would have been just as vicious, if not worse, because then I wouldn't just be selfish, I would be inconsistent. That was the thing about people like Linda and her husband. Their requests were never really requests. They were tests. They hadn't asked me to babysit because they truly believed I was interested in helping out. They had asked because they saw me as an available resource, an untapped well of free labor, and they wanted to see if I could be used. And when I had refused? Well, I had broken the illusion that everyone in the neighborhood played by the same rules. I had proven that I wasn't one of them, and for that, I had to be punished. That realization, that certainty, made my doubts start to dissolve. I had been right to say no. I had been right to stand my ground. And even though the entire experience had been hell, I had also been right to push back when things escalated. If I had backed down, if I had let them intimidate me into silence, they would have just kept going, kept pushing, kept trying to break me. And the second I had involved the police? That was when the spell had broken. Because that was the part they hadn't expected. They had assumed I would either give in or eventually leave. They had assumed my husband and I would be like the other families before us, just another casualty of their unspoken social order. But we hadn't left. We had fought back. And once that happened, once real consequences were introduced, once there was actual accountability, the entire neighborhood had recoiled. The same people who had whispered and sneered and laughed at my expense had suddenly fallen silent. The moment it became real, they had backed off, distancing themselves from the chaos they had helped create. That was the most telling part of all. Because if they had really believed that I was in the wrong, they would have defended Linda and her husband even after the police got involved. They would have argued, made excuses, stood by them. But they didn't. Instead, they abandoned them. And that was proof enough that they had known, on some level, that what they were doing was wrong. They just hadn't cared, until it stopped being fun. So no. I wasn't the asshole. I had been forced into an impossible situation, and I had done the only thing I could do, defend myself. I had protected my home, my peace, my right to say no. And if that made me an outcast? Then so be it. But the strangest part of it all? Ever since Linda and her husband had been taken down a peg, ever since the neighborhood had stopped harassing us, there had been a shift. A quiet, almost imperceptible change in the way people treated us. It wasn't exactly warmth. It wasn't friendship. But it was respect. People who had once sneered at me now simply nodded when they saw me. The neighbors who had laughed behind my back now pretended as if we had never had a problem at all. It was as if, by not allowing myself to be walked over, I had somehow earned a grudging place among them. It was ridiculous. And yet, it was also satisfying. Because at the end of the day, I hadn't wanted their approval. I hadn't wanted their forced smiles or their insincere invitations to their chaotic family gatherings. I had only ever wanted one thing. To be left alone. And finally, it seemed like I was going to get exactly that.